and welcome to another ranking video, and with it being the 10th anniversary of Mad Max Fury Road, I figured what better way to celebrate the occasion than by ranking all of the Mad Max movies. Everything from the original Mad Max movie up to the Mad Max spin-off Furiosa. And I will admit, unlike the previous ranking videos where those were movie franchises I grew up with, I never really grew up with the Mad Max movies like most people. Hell, I think the first Mad Max movie I ever saw was Fury Road in the cinema. Since anytime I tried to watch these movies on cable television growing up, I either saw the last 5 minutes of the movie, or if I did see the movie start, I think I changed the channel to something else because it just didn't interest me at the time. But sometime after the release of Fury Road, I have since then checked out all of the movies in full, and not gonna lie, I was actually very impressed with the consistency of this franchise, because when making this list, I knew what my number one was gonna be, but as far as the other four movies are concerned, they're very consistent in that sense where I honestly don't think there is such thing as a bad installment among them. To such a point that I feel that if I was to re-rank these movies years down the line, the ranking would probably look a lot different. But with that all said, here's my ranking of the Mad Max franchise. And coming in dead last is Mad Max Fury Road. And I know what you're thinking. To quote the words of Immortan Joe, "Oh, mediocre." And I know that putting this movie in 5th place is very blasphemous, considering that most people consider this to be one of the best, if not the best installment of the Mad Max franchise, especially on today of all days, with it being basically the movie's 10th anniversary. So here are my overall thoughts on the movie and why I put Fury Road in this placement. But let's start things off on a positive note first, because Fury Road, of all of the Mad Max movies, is the one that is the most consistently entertaining from start to finish, because it has that adrenaline rush factor. It's also very quotable as hell. It has great production design, from the costumes to some of the sets to a lot of the designs for every single car truck used in the movie. And to on top of that, this movie also has some really great action set pieces seen throughout the entirety of it. And with that all said, if you're wondering if I'm giving such high praise to this movie, why is it dead last? It comes down to 3 reasons. One, misleading title, because even though the movie's called Mad Max Fury Road, I feel like it really should have just been called Fury Road, because the movie is not about Max, it's about Furiosa, which to me is very weird in that sense where it's like making a Spider-Man movie, but you don't focus on Spider-Man, you have it be more about Aunt May than Spider-Man. But honestly, this in the grand scheme of things is more of a nitpick than anything else. Second, even though I did give high praise to this movie, giving you that adrenaline rush, I will admit there are points in time where the movie can function like a sugar high, where it is fun for a few minutes, but you do get exhausted after a little while. But thankfully, there are some nice breaks in between a lot of the action scenes, thankfully. But the third and main reason why I put this movie in dead last has to do with the narrative, because I don't think this movie has aged the best narratively speaking, considering that there is a plot to this movie for about 20 minutes, but from the 20-minute mark up until the closing credits, the majority of the movie just becomes one giant third act, which, again, like I said a few seconds ago, can be very exhausting at points. But I think the biggest offender is that everything about the narrative is both vain and pointless. Starting with the vain part, because Furiosa's mission is to take Immortan Joe's wives and bring them to the green place. They literally encounter a group of people literally near the final 20 minutes of the movie saying, "You passed the green place, it's no longer what it used to be." So her entire mission was in vain. And not only that, but the way everything gets resolved makes the movie pointless. Because Furiosa and Max, when he actually does join the group, sole mission was to get Immortan Joe's wives to a nice secure location that's got food, water, and shelter from his goons. And the whole thing ends with everybody going back to the Citadel. Sure, Immortan Joe and his goons are no longer in charge, but seeing these characters go back to the start just makes the narrative feel very pointless in the grand scheme of things. And I know a lot of people say that the movie is told visually, which it is, but even when taking that into account, narratively speaking, this movie was just very pointless. Now, compare Fury Road with The Road Warrior. That movie ends with this huge epic chase scene, but there is a difference. That movie, the chase, is literally the last act of the movie, and on top of that, that chase scene had purpose and mattered to the overall narrative. Whereas the chase scene that occurs in Fury Road, again, like I mentioned a few seconds ago, was just pointless in the grand scheme of things. Coming in fourth place is the original Mad Max movie. And I'm not gonna lie, this movie really surprised me in terms of how different, in terms of both tonally and visually, the movie is compared to the rest of the franchise, because whereas all the other movies are set in a post-apocalyptic wasteland, this here, the movie's set really in an area where, yes, you could tell something has happened, but it still looks livable. It doesn't have that post-apocalypse vibe to it. And I do like how laid back this movie is, because it is just following the everyday life of Max and the people close to him, no matter if it's his wife and kid or his partner on the police force. And I think out of any villain in the entire franchise, I think the Toe Cutter is perhaps both the most underrated and the creepiest villain to exist within the Mad Max universe. Because the Toe Cutter is the closest thing the Mad Max franchise has to a Joker-like character, considered that he is unpredictable as hell, where sometimes he acts friendly, but the moment you leave him, you don't know what he's gonna do. Is he going to attack you, or is he gonna leave you alone? You just don't know. And unlike all of the other villains, we don't really know what motivates him, which makes him a lot more dangerous than some of the other villains in the franchise. Because whereas all the other villains are trying to get a particular resource like gasoline, the Toe Cutter just seems like the kind of guy who just wants to watch the world burn. However, that all said, the reason why I rank this installment so low has to do with the following reasons. Reason number one, the plot structure doesn't really feel like it has a 3-act structure, because it feels like a series of vignettes that focus on 3 different characters than an actual cohesive movie from start to finish. Because going into this movie, a lot of people describe this movie as a revenge flick about Max trying to get revenge on Toe Cutter and his biker gang for murdering his family, but that's only the last 10 minutes of the movie. Prior to that, the first 45 minutes of the movie is dedicated to his partner on the police force, Goose, doing his job and getting screwed over by the Toe Cutter. And then you got the remainder of the movie where it's just about the wife trying to take care of the kid before getting killed by the Toe Cutter. So it feels like narratively the movie is very misleading in that regard. And because of that, it feels like the movie has both 3 main characters in the form of Max, his wife, and Goose, but it also feels like it doesn't have a main central character. And I will admit, in the first half of the movie, I did find myself bored at points in time, especially when you had a lot of the stuff revolving around the police force releasing one of Toe Cutter's goons due to no witnesses showing up during the jury trial, and a lot of the internal politics surrounding the police force. I just didn't find all that interesting, in my opinion. And on top of that, this movie just felt very prototypey because George Miller's trying to figure out his directing style in the same way that Evil Dead was a prototype for Evil Dead 2, if that makes any sense. Coming in number 3 is Furiosa, a movie that, for me at least, takes a lot of the problems that I had with Mad Max Fury Road and improves upon them by actually having a story that not only has a proper structure to it, but actually has purpose behind the narrative in terms of going from point A to point B, exploring the origins of our titular heroine, Furiosa, and much like the general consensus surrounding the movie's release, Chris Hemsworth's portrayal of Dementus is the absolute highlight of the movie. Seeing him go from being this pseudo-messiah character into becoming this crazed warlord near the end of the movie. And the movie also has so much needed world building within the context of these more recent Mad Max movies. And I thought a lot of the action scenes were plenty of fun when they did occur. Although, that all said, I do have several problems with this movie. One of them being the fact that it didn't feel like I was watching a movie. It felt like I was watching several episodes of a unmade Furiosa TV show being spliced together into a movie. And I also thought that a lot of the visuals looked a little too overproduced, especially with the CGI and green screen, because even though Fury Road also used plenty of CGI and green screen, it was so good you didn't even notice it, whereas here, the CGI and green screen looked like it wasn't rendered fully in certain areas. Although I think the biggest problem I have with the movie is the runtime, because even though the movie has some really good momentum, after a while it starts to just lose the momentum the longer it goes on, because by the time you get to that one action scene set at the bullet farm, I was beginning to lose interest in the movie, narratively speaking, hoping that it would just wrap up, because I was starting to feel the movie's length at that moment. So I think a shorter runtime could have benefited the movie. To a prequel that nobody really asked for in the first place. Coming in second place is, get your hate mail ready, Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome, a movie that everybody considers to be the absolute worst installment of the franchise. To me, I think this movie is just fine. Sure, I do think the weakest part of the movie is the second act, considering that it feels like we entered into a completely different movie in terms of both tone and setting, considering that we have Max dealing with a bunch of these tribal kids. That feels less like Mad Max and more like a post-apocalyptic take on Peter Pan's Lost Boys or The Lord of the Flies. But other than that middle act of the movie, I still thought this movie was fairly solid, and why I rank this one above the other three has to do with one simple reason. In a movie franchise called Mad Max, Max is your main central character here, and we follow the entire story from his perspective. Because in some of the other installments, he's not the main character, he's the secondary protagonist to his own story. Not only that, but I also found the narrative in this movie to be a little more engaging in terms of how we get from point A to point B. You get to explore the wasteland in a very interesting way, even if it does go in a very weird direction midway through the movie. The movie's also very quotable, having some one-liners ranging from, "You and I make a pair, Raggedy Man," to "Who runs Bartertown?" with its most iconic line being, "Two men enter, one man leave." Also, the last act of this movie, even if it is just another chase, is still a really fun climax. Not only that, but you also have Tina Turner playing the main villain in this, and it seems like she was having a lot of fun hamming it up, considering that every time she talks, she's just chewing the scenery left and right. Not only that, but there are some parts in this movie that really caught me off guard, like the fact that you have Max punching a teenage girl, and we see one of these tribal kids literally die on screen in an installment of a franchise that many consider to have lost the hard edge of the first two installments, which I find to be kinda hilarious. And coming in first place is, not surprisingly, Mad Max 2, The Road Warrior, or sometimes The Road Warrior. I mean, what can I really say about this movie that hasn't been said already? I mean, this movie is the movie that set the bar, not just for the Mad Max franchise, but for a lot of movies moving forward, because this is the movie that not only defined the post-apocalyptic subgenre of movies, but also it's the movie that inspired countless imitators. It's also the movie in which George Miller really figured out his style of filmmaking in terms of direction and storytelling. It's also the movie that made Mad Max into a household name, much in the same vein as Evil Dead 2 making Ash Williams a household name, and by extension making Mel Gibson a household name, considering that this movie also launched his entire acting career. It's also one of the few times in which a movie sequel is objectively better than the first installment. The story's a lot better paced, has some really great action scenes, with the best action scene being the final chase. And on top of having some good visual storytelling, it also doesn't explain everything, but it gives you enough bits and pieces of information for you to put two and two together. Like I said with the original Ghostbusters movie, Mad Max The The Road Warrior is an iconic classic for a reason. And there you have it. That's my ranking of the entire Mad Max franchise. So, how would you rank the Mad Max movies? And see you later.